to start off, could you please tell me a little bit about yourself and the work that you do in the environmental movement?
Sure. Gosh, I like should have known that question was coming, but no, I think my name is Faithy Briggs. I'm a filmmaker, and I'd say most of my work falls in the category of I'd say everything's at the intersection of race, history, culture, and environment. I'm based here in Portland, Oregon, on the traditional village sites, the Montney, Wasco, Cowitz, Clackamas, bands of Chinook, and many others who have occupied and called this place home for a long time. I really appreciate the fact that I get to live here. It's definitely changed my focus to being more centered in the outdoors. Let's see, more about the work I do in the environmental movement. My focus as a filmmaker is in representation, which I kind of think about as like whose stories are being told, how are they being told, where, why, and by whom. I've been working in and around representation with a specific focus on Black women's representation in media. It's kind of like what I studied in undergrad. So for the past 10 plus, 12 plus years. And I worked at the Discovery Channel in their environmental documentary department for a little while, learned a ton in that time, and wanted to talk about the environment in a way that was exciting and also put people centered in those conversations.
Yeah, thank you. That's really great. I feel like film is such a great way to engage people. And obviously, throughout history, people of color and women have been excluded. So I think it's really important work that you're doing, just highlighting those voices.
Thank you.
Yeah. So, as a person of color, how have you navigated the predominantly white spaces in the conservation field? And did you learn anything through this process?
Yeah, I mean, I think, I am very privileged based on my education. I think that's a big part of it. And my education, not only like the schools I've been able to go to and the teachers I've been able to learn with, but also in like learning how to navigate historically white spaces, like being socialized in a way where I learned the words, handshakes, ways of being, social activities, things like that, that made it easy for folks to be around me, and I think that goes back to there's a lot of history of respectability, politics, and cultural ways of making mainly white people feel comfortable. And so, though I wish I didn't have to do that, I hope that like I can open the doors for other people to be able to be fully themselves in whatever space they walk into and still be greeted with respect and welcomeness. Unfortunately, very often, like there are parts of who we are that get seen as unprofessional, and I'm uh, based on a culture that was created, um, by white people without our lived experiences, without our culture. So it's a long way of saying like it is hard to be, we call ourselves a lot of things, the unicorn or one of the onlys. Um, and it fortunately or unfortunately, like because of my privilege, I'm able to feel a lot more comfortable in those spaces than a lot of other people. And I'm very conscious of that. And I also kind of feel like, you know, to whom much is given, much is expected. And I certainly think I have a responsibility to represent in those spaces, even based on the fact that, like, I was a double major in African American studies and film studies in undergrad at Yale University. And I learned a lot of language that has helped me um, take on the role of educating other folks when it comes down to inclusion. And I hope sometimes that my ability to have those conversations, though I am not a DEI educator, and that's not my goal. But I hope that I can take that burden off of sometimes every brown person that walks into a room, to not have to be asked like kind of shocking, strange questions, to like educate people on what they don't know. That said, I appreciate honest curiosity when people don't know what they don't know. So I move into that role. This is a partial answer to your question. But what have I learned? I've learned that I think sometimes people are, especially with the ongoing and incomplete reckoning around racial injustice that is happening in our country, and hopefully is going to have some really positive outcomes thanks to the work of folks from the Black Lives Matter movement and many others who have realized that there is a problem that they hadn't previously seen or recognized. I think that based on that movement, a lot of people are like trying to figure out what diversifying their environmental groups and spaces and recreation focused groups look like. And I think sometimes they're asking the wrong questions. You know, I've gone from being like, yeah, let me strategize with you on how to like make your group more inclusive or more diverse, to being like, do you know any of the people that you're trying to invite? Like, do you know any Black people? Do you know any Asian people? Do
Yeah.
you know any Native folks? Because if you don't know anyone from there, you need to stop recruiting and start showing up. Like, I think,
Yeah.
it's like, where do I find the Black hikers? It's like, just go find some Black people. Just go hang out. Don't go with an agenda. Don't don't go with an invite in hand. Don't go with the intention of doing something for your group.
Mm.
Go with the intention of like showing up and figuring out what people are doing. And I bet you'll find a hiker who's stoked and wants to hear more. But I think like showing up pamphlet in hand to like invite brown people to what you're doing just feels really misplaced sometimes too. And so trying to like, okay, great, we've gotten to the point where we're like, we want to show up with pamphlets, like that's mad like progress. Now let's like look at the difference between diversity and inclusion. So
I really like the part you said about responsibility, because obviously us just being here says something about our privilege. And like, if not us, then who? So I'm hoping that this
totally.
interview series will, help pave the way for other people who don't have that kind of privilege. And then my next question is about your film, This Land. And then this film discusses the barriers that BIPOC people face regarding public land. And then can you tell me ways in which you seek to break down these factors in the other work that you do?
All work, including This Land, which is a film I'm really proud of, is also inherently flawed. I think like to make a film about public lands is to buy into a conceit that land should be owned, that public lands are for everyone, right? And even that sometimes feels disingenuous if we're really talking about um, the context in which we all live, right? We live in a world that is contextualized by structural racism that has created stuff like our park system, which is literally based on genocide and forced removal.
Yeah.
So like people are like, oh, like I think I'm often worried that I'm like not fun, like, here's Faith with like the truth bombs. They're gonna like
Yeah.
make it not fun. But I think like it's really important for us to be able to say like some messed up stuff that we inherited, that is like our legacy as Americans, our legacy as like people on the planet. There's like some bad stuff that's been done to people, to animals, to our planet. And like, I think that to move towards solutions and to move towards something that looks like fixing, we have to be able to acknowledge the wrong stuff. So I think that's, a huge part of my hope on This Land I hope on this one was really to widen the conversation around public lands that I felt like was happening, because what I've learned from my time being one of the few people in some of the spaces where I find myself, where we are talking about environment or conservation conversations, is that there is a reason why there isn't greater representation of people of color in those rooms. And it is not a lack of interest. It is a lack of explicit invitation. I think, I mean, I talk about this a lot, but like, we need to remember that people were explicitly disinvited from public spaces, that parks said on them, whites only, that when desegregation happened, a lot of public spaces were purposely privatized, and small entry fees were put on them so that Black, Brown, Asian, Native folks couldn't go to them. That was explicit. And there really hasn't been as explicit an invitation saying, hey, we really want you here. So it's like, we don't want you. We're not allowed to say we don't want you anymore. But what is like, where does the other shoe drop on the like, we actually really want you to be here part? And I think that is something that I'm very aware of in seeing like who is out in these places and who feels comfortable, you know. And when we talk about safety, a lot of times people are like, what do you mean you're scared to be out there? What do you mean it's not safe? You think someone's going to run after you with an axe? And it's like, maybe not, you know, like, no, when I go hiking, I don't think that's what's going to happen. But safety also relates to like comfort, you know. Are people going to look at you and say, oh, like, how often do you do this hike? Or, oh, is this your first time? Or, oh, you know, like, and then you're made strange. You're made to feel strange in these places. And so when you go to a place in your free time with the little bit of leisure that you have, when you take all this activation energy to like drive to a place and pack a bag and do a hike, and then you're made to feel strange, why is that what you're going to choose to do with your free time? Like, the barrier to just showing up and being able to feel invited and welcome, that's a big barrier. And that is also a question of like the self-confidence of individuals and communities, you know, who have not been made to feel that they should navigate the world with confidence. So I think like some of the stuff that I hope to address, it's not as specific as I think a lot of other people are. I'm not trying to, like, I am, but I'm not saying like my goal is to see more Black people hiking. Like, my goal is to, you know, see more Native kids on bikes. Like, I would love all of those things to happen, and like want to be involved in projects about, you know, them. And at the same time, I think that the bigger question is like culture shift. What does culture shift look like? And I think as an artist and a filmmaker, like, those are the kinds of questions that I'm kind of supposed to be, or the kind of questions that I'm tasked with, is like, what questions can you ask? What images can you create that make people think in a way that could shift culture? Like, if, I mean, that would be huge.
Yeah, I think art and creativity is one of the best one of the best ways to actually reach people and make a shift, because it's obviously, when you're making a culture shift, you have to think about all of these huge overarching things: structural racism, um, gender inequality, everything. Yeah, I just think that what you're doing is really important.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Well, I just want to shout out, like, I was selected as a grist fixer in the year 2021, and it's been really exciting to be a part of that group too, because they're like all about using our imagination to see what is possible. And I just don't think we are really encouraged to spend much time there, like imagining a future where things are just and equitable for the environment and for people. And so I just appreciate being encouraged to think that way too.
What advice you would give to a young person of color seeking to enter the conservation field?
I think seeking mentorship.
Mm.
is like the most important thing, because finding mentors who are people of color, especially in the outdoor space, or like fierce fighters for equity and justice, can allow you to keep being yourself in these
Mm.
spaces, versus thinking that if you're going to be in this world, you have to copy the existing kind of status quo profile of who is in the room. Because I think it's really hard to remain yourself and realize that like your experiences, your knowledge, your stories about your auntie's like window gardens, and like that, all of that is not only valid, but it is like really important in terms of adding to the conversations that we're having. But I think very often it's hard to think that those experiences and those knowledges are like as relevant when you're in rooms that hold a lot of historic power. And a lot of the environmental and conservation spaces, they do, they have a lot of historic power, and that historic power hasn't recognized like Afrocentric and indigenous values. So I just think when you're navigating historically white spaces, it can be really hard to not like get lost like in here. I think particularly for PGM, self-confidence.
Mm.
It's so hard. It's so hard to believe you are enough when every thing that you have been told and shown from the time you were like being carried out into the world and seeing billboards and hearing things on public transportation, things that you can't even understand, and what you read in your books in school, and who's in the cartoons that you watch or the books that you read. I mean, I think a few years ago there was a study by We Need Diverse Books that said there were far more talking animals than kids of color in our children's books. And so it's like, I want to be a bear or a white person, like
Yeah.
how do you like move with confidence in who you are? So I always kind of come back to feeling like comfortable and ready to be able to like take up space. So yeah, mentorship is huge, and fierce, like fierce co-conspirators, people who are like having your back, the people in the room who are being like, actually, Allie said something really important. Could you say that again? And you're like, oh, someone did hear what I said, not, or actually like, I'd really love to hear from this person if you have anything to say, like people that know what sharing power looks like. And I love Jose Gonzalez, who's the founder of Latino Outdoors and does so many other things, that he asks the question a lot: what power are you willing to hold on to in order to be able to share it, and what power are you willing to give up?
My next question is, what is your hope for the future of the conservation field?
I think that people being able to see this work as being about people and planet is really important to me. I think it's still in many circles, and I host a podcast called The Trail Ahead, and I've gotten to talk to some amazing conservationists, and they say that it's still hard in a lot of their fields to talk about people being important, being even as important, and so it sounds like it's like putting people first is still a really controversial idea in a lot of conservation spaces, and like trying to, so even digging into what that looks like is really hard. And so I think people think that what we're, like you're saying, is like we want to bulldoze forests to build houses, and it's like that is not not the only way of looking at this idea. Like, what does it mean to ask what the impact on the community nearby is going to be? What does it mean to like fight hard for environmental impact statements to actually work with tribes, and like not just like push it through and consultation looking like a sign off, like I think like I really hope that understanding that like making making decisions about our planet without looking at those who are most affected by environmental degradation is like no way to do this work. So in the future, I hope that's like obvious. I just hope a lot of stuff becomes like really obvious, like duh. And you
Yeah.
don't have to be like, I just wanted to like make sure we weren't doing blah blah blah. And they're like, oh duh, like we would never do that. Not like,
Yeah.
oh. That would be rad.
That would be good.
So I really hope that everything that's happened in the past few years has made the environmental community realize that like those intersectional politics are directly related to the work that we do in the outdoors. It's directly related. Like every trail that we walk on is native land, and we need to think about what that means when we're creating policy. So I have a lot of hope, but I think my hope is vested in individuals and community groups and grassroots organizations who can have ideally more consistency than like our big government can have. So I think it's like putting hope in a lot of different places.
That's a good point. Yeah, I feel like this is my opinion, but I feel like a lot of the change that has been happening with people realizing how intersectional the issue is with environmental justice has come about because of the work of BIPOC people.
Totally.
So yeah, I just hope that more allies get involved so that we're not the ones always pushing it. Because it is hard, but it is work that needs to be done too. So that's always
Yeah.
something that I think about.
I mean, I've been thinking about precisely that a lot this week, in the sense of like, how do we move from being allies to being co-conspirators? And I think the answer is that it has to affect, like, white allies need to feel not that they are helping, that they are directly impacted when injustice happens. And that's back to like a culture shift and a mindset change in a way, but to say like when racism happens, white people are also directly affected by the wrongdoing. Like, what is there's a lot of really good writing by people like Resma Minikin about like the psychic trauma of having to be okay with racism um, and having to be okay with benefiting from white supremacist systems. Like, what does that do to an individual?
Right.
And to have to be steeped in denial because the truth of that is too much, or the guilt of that makes you feel frozen. Like, what does being directly affected by injustice look like for white people, and what would moving to a place where it all felt super personal look like? I'm not saying I want everyone to experience racism or experience ableism or experience misogyny. I'm just wondering if it felt more personal, what might change in terms of how you got involved. Like it, because I think that's one of the things that, like, as BIPOC advocates, very often it's like people be like, well, what fuels your activism? It's like my existence. I
Yeah.
don't have a choice but to like try to stand up for myself and the people around me. And if that makes me an activist, then like, okay, but sometimes it doesn't even feel that way. I mean, myself and so many others, we don't want to call ourselves activists. We're advocates because it's a more comfortable word, because I'm not out there with signs every day, like as a frontline person. And I'm so grateful for folks who are constantly like pushing on the front lines and being the thorn in one side that says like we can't be ignored. And I hope I'm like reinforcements in the work that I'm doing. But yeah, I think like that's a big question now is it's got to matter to everyone for it to change. It can't just be like, oh, I did my, 12 hours of racial justice work
Yeah.
over the past year with my job, and like I have a certificate saying I get it. So like I'm good. You know, I think it has to be like everyone needs to show up and look at their children's schools and their soccer teams and their daycares and their PTAs and their offices and look around and be like, hey, what perspectives are missing here?
Yeah.
What could we like, who's not here that could make this work better? Let's think about like how we can like better reach our audience, have like more diversity of ideas and experiences in this room. Like I think like people have to realize that like they are actually not benefiting as well
Right.
when people of color aren't included.